these challenges have been indeed extremely poor in the Karachi context.
These are issues that stay with us all throughout the year, all throughout the decades.
I think that in the urban Pakistan context, in many ways, it's already too late. We need to open up the black box of what I mean when we say it's too late. So it may not be too late for certain segments of the city, but certainly might be late for certain other parts of the city. When my colleagues and I at the Karachi Urban Lab at IBA, when we were leading a very large project on extreme heat, we've done a pretty massive survey of 13,500 households across the city on heat risk perceptions. One of the very interesting anecdotal pieces of evidence that kept coming up was how, and there's a gendered aspect to mental health impacts also, that's about sleeplessness and how women, especially in low-income settlements, whether they were high-density zones or low-density zones across the city, were constantly complaining about living in tiny, tiny homes and where the kitchen would get so overheated. The 5-6 years of budgeting data that we looked at, there was absolutely no priority given.
Hello and welcome again to this installment of Front Seat to Climate Change. We continue our conversations under the Breathe Pakistan initiative, and we are speaking today to Dr. Nausheen Anwar, who is an expert on urbanism and as well as worked heavily around heat and flooding and is faculty at IBA in Karachi and University of Sussex. So welcome to the show, Dr. Nausheen.
Thank you.
And I think just to start it off, I think we can get into your work right away. Karachi has had issues on heat and flooding both, and I think you have been one of those members of the academia that has been trying to resolve those issues. So when we talk about global warming, climate change, a bit of our understanding is that the impact cities like Karachi face are driven by the overall average warming of the planet, but in part because of failures of urban planning as well. So I think this is where we can start off as well. How much in Karachi at least we can blame poor urban planning as the fault in our stars?
That's a great question, Dabar, and if I may answer that question in a couple of different ways. So first of all, I would like to point out, I would like to underscore the following. Climate change, without a doubt, is increasingly having an impact on cities like Karachi in Pakistan and elsewhere across the global urban south. But climate change can also be a red herring at times. So when we look at issues of extreme heat and flooding, the urban planning aspect, the infrastructural planning aspect must be brought into conversation. So the flooding issues in Karachi, which have crept up and come to the forefront in profoundly disturbing ways, have been happening for quite a while now, for well over a decade, for almost 2 decades. And at the very outset, when Karachi was flooding, although there is an aspect here that if you go into the historical archive of the city, there was always a bit of flooding, even historically speaking, in the early 1900s. And so now the situation, of course, has changed because the city has grown. There's been a considerable amount of expansion to the built environment, and you have expansive settlements. You have high density to urban sprawl, a lot of concrete poured into the environment. And with that, I think there is a disjuncture in planning and engineering terms in terms of how the built environment has been sutured together. And by this I mean literally in terms of how roads have been built, how high or low they are, and their positionality in terms of the overall sort of placement of other kinds of building structures. This is an engineering question also. Yeah. And urban planning, of course, involves both, and it involves both the social and the technocratic engineering aspect to it also. So engineering solutions have not been able to keep pace with the kind of infrastructural demands that have intensified in the city. So overall, infrastructure planning / urban planning has failed miserably in Karachi. And I would say that this is also a large part a story that we find across cities in the global urban south and perhaps in other parts of Pakistan also. And in fact, urban planning and infrastructural violence and infrastructure planning have become a source of violence in cities like Karachi today. And so what happens is that within this very complex structural story of inequality, of anti-poor urban planning, which began in 1947 onwards, you then add the compounding and cascading effects of climate change. Yes. So you then have a kind of a Molotov cocktail of sorts that really blows up every time we have a heat wave, or we have chronic heat issues that are seasonal. We know that summers are lasting longer. And so it's not just heat waves that come in a given moment, but it's literally the length of the summer season. And then the floods that come, maybe one year they'll come, maybe the next year they won't come because of the uncertainty of it all. So urban planning responses and solutions to all of these challenges have been indeed extremely poor in the Karachi context.
Yeah, no, so I think when we look at Karachi example, it's always this picture of shock and all, like, flooding has happened and the realization is, okay, urban planning was not there to respond to it. But issues like chronic heat, extreme heat, air pollution, your general feel of the city, having green spaces, these are issues that stay with us all throughout the year, all throughout the decades, and they have also gotten worse and worse over time. And this essentially now is a climate and health issue, where the people's not just physical health, their mental health as well, and then also you have a generation growing up with really bad air quality. They can't play outside in winter because of air pollution, in summer because of heat wave, in monsoon because it's flooded. There's a generation that doesn't go out. They have developed, their socializing is in a very congested environment as well, without green spaces. So in a long-term view, do you see climate and health being responded by urban planning, not just in Pakistan's context, but also Global South in general? And if it is not being addressed at this point, won't we be too late, say even a few years from now, to start responding to it?
It's a great question. I think that in the urban Pakistan context, in many ways, it's already too late. I think, and we need to sort of kind of open up the black box of what I mean when we say it's too late. So it may not be too late for certain segments of the city, but certainly might be late for certain other parts of the city. So when we talk about the more elite, the more upscale parts of the city, and how issues of sanitation and water and greening are addressed, there is a certain aspect of inequality built into the urban planning response system, infrastructure planning response systems. Whereas when you go towards the informal, the Kachi Abadis, the low-income settlements, which are actually squeezed into a much tinier proportion of the overall city's land, and I don't have the exact figure before me, but at the Karachi Urban Lab, where I'm founder and director, we actually did a calculation of that. My colleague, Dr. Adam Abdullah, who is assistant professor of urban planning at IBA in the SSLA department, we did a calculation of that in our heat governance report, and that actual figure is actually in a footnote in that report, and it's actually quite shocking to see, where low-income settlements, informal settlements are positioned in relation to the rest of the city. And these are precisely the settlements in the parts of the city which suffer the most acute forms of infrastructural degradation, where the greening aspect is the least, where you may find, I don't have access to this data, where you may find particularly hazardous, deeply unequal indicators of well-being and health, essentially. And also where people have the least access to cooling systems. So, and that sort of dovetails with the whole extreme heat aspect also. And these are also very much the neighborhoods that get impacted by flooding, which is not to denude the importance of places like DHA that were really impacted in the 2022 floods, but then the response system to those kinds of environments and the upgradation of that was very different in comparison to what has been happening for decades in low-income settlements, parts of Arangi town, parts of Baldia. I mean, there's a long history, deep history over here where the government has not addressed these issues. So there is now increasing evidence across the global north, and there is this particular report that was put out, I think came out last year or the year before that. If you want access to the report, I'll be happy to share it with you, looking at the European context specifically in terms of the relationship between climate change impacts and mental health. And the report says quite, with very good authority, that mental health and health issues in general, and this is just for Europe, are the least, are given the least importance, are not on the radar, have the least amount of funding, whereas bits and pieces of evidence that are now coming out are beginning to show a fairly strong correlation between climate change impacts and mental health issues, which in turn would be associated with long-standing structural issues, which in turn are embedded in a very anti-poor urban planning dynamic. So we are not having conversations on this in Pakistan at all. So, and I will give you a very, very small piece of anecdotal evidence. This is not hardcore evidence or data by any means. But when my colleagues and I at the Karachi Urban Lab at IBA, when we were leading a very large project on extreme heat, we've done a pretty massive survey of 13,500 households across the city on heat risk perceptions, and we're actually in the course of cleaning up that data. And one of the very interesting anecdotal pieces of evidence that kept coming up was how, and there's a gendered aspect to mental health impacts also, and that's about sleeplessness, and how women, especially in low-income settlements, whether they were high-density zones or low-density zones across the city, were constantly complaining about living in tiny, tiny homes, and where the kitchen would get so overheated that, and now with the urban heat island effect and these sorts of issues at night, that they felt that the zehni tashaddud, that is the word that they used, was constant, because sleeplessness was an issue that was coming up for them, for their daughters, for their children, and then escaping from that environment, going outside was no longer possible because the entire configuration of the city has changed also. And how that aspect of sleeplessness feeds into mental health issues really is, it's a very interesting and a very challenging aspect of what we mean by relationship between the built environment, long-standing structural issues, climate change, compounding, cascading risks, and the mental health dimension. So these are actually the kinds of issues where we need more evidence.
We actually have this paper that came out this July 2024, and it recorded the responses from people who had been displaced immediately in the aftermath of the 2022 floods. And it recorded that 38% of the people displaced now had depressive episodes or had serious stress issues, because even if they might have returned to their homes, that trauma also carries on. And at the same time, we also have this other side of the picture where the actual environmental degradation, such as air pollution, actually also mental health, but also directly your bodily development of cognitive skills or cognitive functions, neurological development, is being impacted for children under the age of 16. And that again has long-term impacts. It could be motor functions of the body, it could be their thought process of thinking ability and economic livelihood impact in the long run, and also mental health. And this is where I want to also understand more, such as heat. If we take extreme heat, what are the potential impacts on a human body that are either life-threatening or create a sort of ability or your body's ability reduces it to just do general day-to-day things?
So that's a fantastic question. So, and this is where actually we need more evidence, right? That how does extreme heat actually impact the human body from a physiological and epidemiological perspective? So, so I actually am now going to be starting a new project with a climate scientist based at King's College London, and this project is going to be focused on Jacobabad, and it's looking at this notion of unseen climate extremes and what does it mean when we talk about the unseen, essentially. And I think that that is very, very pertinent to the broader discourse on extreme heat impacts on the human body. So I'm not a physiologist, I'm an urban planner, but over the last several years, my work has become more interdisciplinary, where I'm now finding myself working more and more alongside climate scientists, physiologists, epidemiologists. And I find that this is an increasingly important thing to do if we are to be able to generate the kind of evidence that is needed to answer the kind of question that you've just posed. So there is, for instance, clinical psychologists and social psychologists have done work in the past where they've just looked at heat, not necessarily climate change related, and there is evidence to show that heat has an impact on cognitive functions. And then there is a broader discourse in the medical community about the extent to which heat might affect the cardiovascular system or kidneys. And then there is an increasing discourse on how actually we might be at a new conjuncture now, where there is a new kind of a kidney disease that has come up related to extreme heat. And there is someone who is actually doing research on this based, I think, in the United Kingdom. I can't remember the person's name. So there are certain kinds of underlying conditions that may come to the forefront because of extreme heat impacts. But then extreme heat is also a stealth-like killer. So people might be exposed to high temperatures, not necessarily just ambient temperatures related to the outside, but there is this whole aspect of overheating indoors, especially when we take the WBGT into consideration, which brings the humidity factor. So this notion of lethal heat that climate scientists are now talking about, and then its interactions in urban settings with issues of the urban heat island. So there is, a debate that's emerging. There are a whole series of questions that are emerging that we need to start looking. We need to bring medical scientists on board, physiologists on board. There has to be a broader conversation on, well, what are we actually talking about when we talk about extreme heat? Because people might be exposed to extreme heat conditions repeatedly every year, but they may not die of it immediately. Like say, we see the impact of floods, which are very visceral. You see the destruction immediately. You see trees fall, you see people drown or get hurt, and the diseases that come out of that. But with extreme heat, the story is really, really, it's really off the radar. So the mental health impacts, the kidney, the cardiovascular, but I think most of all the mental health aspect, the body breaking down. So people often ask, well, is it possible for the human body to actually adapt to the kind of new sorts of thresholds that we are seeing? So Jacobabad, I think it was in 2022, exceeded a threshold of, what was it, 51 or 52 Celsius?
It was 52.
I can't, 52, right. So, well, what does it mean? That was an unforeseen thing, right? So what does it mean about people in Jacobabad living with those sorts of temperatures? They've lived with high temperatures for hundreds of years. We know that entire region is super hot in comparison to cities like Karachi. So can the human body actually adapt itself? Maybe it can, but maybe there is something else happening inside, which is a slow breakdown that we don't know of. So there aren't any clear-cut questions to this, so we really, really do need more evidence. And the project that I've just now become involved with, these are exactly the kinds of questions that we wish to address.
No, Jacobabad is actually a very interesting example, because as part of my work, we did this study, I think, back in 2020 and 21, where, so I personally think that it's not feasible over a short period of time to humans to adapt to the heat. But it's the practices that are necessarily saving them from the extreme heat. And they have this interesting workday schedule that they pause their work at 11 a.m. or 12 noon, because they've started also at 5 a.m. And then they'll take a 4-hour break until the afternoon heat goes away and the temperature is down, that they can work again, and then they'll work through evening and night as well. So the working class in Jacobabad has adapted in this way. But then this idea that you mentioned, a certain physiological impact on the body, liver disease and kidney function disease, we are actually seeing that in Jacobabad. And we spoke to this doctor in Jacobabad Institute of Medical Sciences, which is also the hospital over there. And they say that they get a lot of cases of renal failure, especially the age group of 50 and beyond. And those are similar to people who actually work in hot environments, such as tanneries or your brick kilns. So it's very interesting that people who worked for years in an occupational environment that was hot have similar impacts to people who just live in a hot environment overall. So that's really interesting. But all of this evidence, for example, do you think it's being taken seriously in policy circles that it might impact the urban planning policies? And is the evidence really, the sort that we can make, implement a change in our overall thinking about urban management as well?
Within Pakistan, I personally don't think it's being taken seriously at all. I think, again, I think that we've seen on the pollution side, we've been having conversations about that, part of the larger group that we're all a part of, that health really has not been prioritized on the pollution side. I think that it sort of speaks to the political economy of this country. The political economic issues always underwrite policy priorities and policy concerns. I will always stand first on that. So there is a certain history embedded here in terms of, well, why are we not taking health and education issues as the number one issues? Why is such much larger of our overall national budget going towards the military? And these are old historical issues which are there at the forefront even today. So no, I think that on extreme heat, the conversations in any case are quite circumscribed. They're very limited. For instance, we are not talking about community-based adaptation mitigation plans. what is the knowledge embedded, exactly the kind of thing you were talking about, these shifting rhythms that people adjust to, their knowledge, right? How can this knowledge actually be scaled up? Those are the sorts of things we need, which would then feed into health policies. Well, what is the health budget looking like? So my colleague Mohammed Tawheed and I, we did he's also over at the Karachi Urban Lab, and we did a quick analysis of Karachi's budget over the last 5 or 6 years, and this is a policy brief that should come out soon. And we were looking at, well, how much of that budget is actually going towards heat risk mitigation, and we found it's almost zero. And there's more towards flooding, but towards health concerns concerning extreme heat risk mitigation, actually there was nothing. Maybe it's changed over the last year, but the 5-6 years of budgeting data that we looked at, there was absolutely no priority given. So this sort of then symbolizes the conversations up at the top and even at the provincial level really are not prioritizing health issues in relation to extreme heat or even pollution for that matter. But it can be done, and it is being done in other parts of the world. And it's not enough to have a disaster risk mitigation strategy that says, well, there's a heat wave coming and we have to put out a warning, because that's really about quick responses and like a sort of a disaster-induced response. It's not actually dealing with structural issues, which require a different kind of depth of analysis and a more substantive form of planning, which is both short-term and long-term. Because what we're doing is actually reactive in a sense.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
No, so thank you a lot for those insights. These are very helpful. And with that, we would also conclude. But when we look at policy issues, this is very key, that all the material that is being produced both locally, and also you have so many examples of similar contexts all over the world. And a lot of those solutions can be transplanted, can be adopted for our context. But simply the relevant policy-making circles are not responsive enough. The knowledge is quite old, especially people who manage these administrative setups and everything. The training is inadequate as well, particularly in regards to climate and health. The relationship between understanding how non-communicable diseases are increasing over time, such as all these cardiovascular impacts of air pollution and heat, that's still very limited. And we hope that maybe more and more evidence coming out of Pakistan will change the tide towards more of this thought process. So with that, we would conclude, and stay tuned for more.